and disrespected this week. What measures should we put in place to evaluate these teams in the college football playoff rankings? This is the College Game Day Podcast. Glad to have you with us. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel, joined today by EJ Manuel, standout analyst on the ACC network and various other places, former Florida State great, first-round draft pick, all kinds of credentials. We want to remind you to download this podcast wherever you prefer to get your podcast, or better yet, subscribe and never miss an episode. So, the latest edition of the College Football Playoff Rankings released last night, abbreviated College Football Playoff Top 25 show due to the Champions Classic in college basketball. Oregon, Ohio State leading the way. 4 of the 5 teams in the top 5 were in the Big Ten. Texas in the middle, and then BYU is at 6, and then the last team in the field as an at-large would be Ole Miss. Boise State getting in as the 5th highest ranked conference champion at this point, and first team out, the Georgia Bulldogs, which brings me to some of the things that you're going to hear today that I've been thinking about for a while, guys. In the immediate aftermath, no matter what you watch, whether it's our show, another show, you click on any of your favorite sports websites and you're going to hear this team was disrespected. I'm outraged about this. The committee did this wrong. This is a joke. That's this. This is that. On the other side, you're going to hear guys like me a whole lot of times preach patience. It'll work itself out. So here's what I am proposing, gentlemen. What is it that you value? What if we establish what we value? And it's not going to be the same thing among 13 committee members. That's why you have a committee. You're going to have people who value different things and you try to strike a balance. So for me, here are the things I value. And we'll dive into these as we go along. Do you look the part? When I watch you play, do you look like a playoff team? I'm not talking about recruiting rankings. I'm not talking size, weight, speed. I'm talking about, as a team, do you look like a playoff team? What are you when you're at your best? What are you capable of when you're at your best? An example, Georgia at its best is capable of dismantling Texas, which leads us to, how often have you been at your best? Who was it against? Strength of schedule. Indiana has passed with flying colors my first 3 questions, and they flunked miserably against the 4th one. And what are you now? That brings into a question a number of teams. So if you break it down, and there might be other criteria, Pete, but I started thinking about this, and it's so easy to say, well, I don't like that Indiana's 5, or I don't like that Tennessee's too low, or I don't like where BYU is. What is it that you want? What is it that you value when you're looking at these teams?
A great question. I'll make an observation first. The most 24-24 moment of the season may have been when I watched the end of Indiana-Michigan and said to myself, Indiana, the program with the most losses in college football history, is going to be criticized for the way they beat Michigan, the winningest team in college football history. Yep. If you need to sum up like 2024 on a fortune cookie, that might be it. That might be a little long for a fortune cookie. You might need 2, but like that to me was just like, whoa, it's all bending. I value, like, I feel like we're doing a mission statement for our podcast here. We have to express our core values, Rece. Yes. I value wins. That's what I value the most. This committee values losses. We talked about that last week. One of the breadcrumbs that they left was if you lose to Oregon or Ohio State, and we saw it again with Penn State this week, you're going to be, those are going to be valued. But if I had to distill my core values to one thing, I want wins. I want good wins. In a way, I feel like I want Georgia to get more credit for A, playing, and B, beating Clemson. Like, I feel like if they had just played, Georgia Northeastern, some random NAIA school that week, they'd be in pretty rough shape right now, to be honest. So, again, EJ, we talk about this on our pod all the time. We don't root for teams. We don't root for anything, but we root hard for really good games, right? Yeah. We want those big interconference clashes to start the season. But if I had to distill my values, Rece, to one thing, I want to see who you beat. And then, the sub of that obviously would be strength of schedule. I don't feel like this committee generally has valued strength of schedule enough, which leads us to the next thing. It's who have you lost to, why? And then some of the aesthetics. How have you looked during those losses, etc.? What about you, EJ? What are your core values?
I'm pretty sure we're all going to have similar values, but maybe in different orders, because I ultimately value, did you win? The second one will be, do you pass the test? Like, do you look like you could compete with an Oregon? Do you look like you could compete with a LSU at night? Do you look like you could go into LSU at night like Alabama did and dominate a football game? And you asked that about Indiana. I'd ask that about SMU, all these other teams in different conferences. And it's tough because in college football, the difference between an NFL playoff, we all know this. In the NFL, if you just win a game by 1 point, that's all that matters. You survive that weekend, you advance. In college football, there's so many different criteria. And Rece, I think you asked great questions toward Manuel, because what exactly is the criteria? I don't see a spreadsheet anywhere that exactly shows us what the actual bullet points of what they are looking at. But I think it's those two big things. Do you win those games? And then how do you look? I think with a football eye, I have a good feel for what teams can kind of compete. And I'll even say this, pat myself on the back, to be honest, guys. I said back after week 3 or week 4, Colorado had that look to me. I think they went and got dominated by Nebraska, I believe, just out physical. But then when they went on the road to UCF, it was one of those games, maybe week 4, week 5, where I kind of started to see, like, okay, if they solid up the offensive line, if they can run the ball just a tad, protect Shedeur Sanders, who I think can be a Heisman Trophy winner, along with his teammate Travis Hunter, that team can compete in a round of 12 with some of the other 11 best teams in the country. And they have that opportunity now if they win the Big 12. So ultimately, I think, do you have that eye test? And then also, what games did you win? The loss, sure, I get it. I mean, some of these losses were close. I know Ohio State had a close loss to Oregon. Penn State, close loss to Ohio State. So that does justify it. But ultimately, when we get to the last weeks of the season and then the conference championships, that settles a lot of these questions too.
I think, Pete, to your point about valuing losses, I think they have in some cases, and maybe it was simply football judgment, because Georgia would argue its losses haven't been valued. Now, I would then say the counterpoint to that is the way that they lost to Ole Miss. And also, while they deserve all kinds of credit for coming back in the last quarter and a half against Alabama, it was a remarkable comeback that ultimately came up short. But how they lost was pretty ugly too, because they got behind 30-7 or whatever it was at halftime. So some of their losses have been how you lost. Now, along with this, and I think the committee's charge, it is, if you look at the selection committee protocol and criteria, it is simply to select the best teams.
Right.
They have some guiding principles that are not necessarily listed in order, and they also are only used to distinguish teams among otherwise comparable teams. For instance, if they think Team A is much, much better than Team B, then they're not going to default to strength of schedule, head-to-head competition, comparative outcomes, or whether teams have had injuries, all of which are listed and have been for quite some time on the college football playoffs principles and protocol. So it sort of brings me, though, Pete, you say you value wins. Well, Indiana, and I'm not picking on them. I think I've got Indiana. I think I have them ranked 6th in the AP poll, so it's not like it's inappropriate that they're 5. But if you're going to poke holes in where Indiana sits right now, well, they've played one team that currently has a winning record, and it's Nebraska, who's in free fall. What is their best win? I don't know. Nebraska? 5-5 Michigan. Who else gets credit for beating 5-4 and 5-5 teams? And the same can be said for Texas. I mean, Texas is number 3. Their strength of schedule is not as bad as Indiana's. Indiana's currently like 100 or 103 or something like that, and Texas is like in the mid 50s, like 55. What's Texas' best win? Vanderbilt. I mean, okay, so Vanderbilt beat Alabama. They beat Virginia Tech. They're not the same old Vanderbilt. They're better, but that's what we're giving credit for the win is beating Vanderbilt. And I'm not saying because Texas passes all of those other tests to me. Sure. I still think Texas had a bad night. They got their fannies kicked by Georgia, and maybe Georgia would do it again if they played. I don't know, but I think Texas overall, from start to finish, with the exception of that game in which they got manhandled, looks like an elite team. But it's hard to back it up on the resume. The other little thing, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but the one thing I will say is if you are screaming for Indiana and Texas, for that matter, to be ranked highly, and you are screaming that I just want them, win the games, doesn't really matter who they play. But if you play Georgia's schedule and you lose 2, you're out. Or if you lose 3, if Tennessee kicks a 62-yard field goal and beats you between the hedges, you are done, done, done. If that's what you're saying, you have a right to say it. But I am not here to listen to you when you start saying, hey, SEC, play 9 games. Hey, I don't want you to play a double directional state, Georgia. I want you to play Clemson. You can't have it both ways, man. If you're going to say that the 100th ranked schedule is number 5 and you're good with that, you agree with it, you think that's as it should be, and the number 1 schedule is not worthy of the playoff, then I don't want to hear the other stuff. Now, the other thing is, if you come and you say, I know, I don't care, Indiana is a better football team, crisper football team. They're playing better than Georgia. They're better than Georgia. I'm here for it. End of discussion. That's what the subjectivity is about. If you want to say, I know Texas lost to Georgia, I think Texas is better than Georgia, go ahead. I'm fine with it. You just have to balance those judgments with the actual results. The actual results have to matter, but they can be mitigated and balanced with some other considerations.
So let me ask both of you this. Do we have a 3-loss team in this college football play?
Absolutely not. No.
Really?
No.
Rece Davis?
No.
Depends. Possibly.
I would say probably.
Yeah, and here's what I'm thinking, EJ. Let's say, and I'm rooting so hard for this, Pete. I hope I'm allowed to root for this.
I'm rooting for chaos. I feel like Sonny Vaccaro always used to say that. I root for chaos. It was a good line.
I'm rooting for the 8-way first place tie in the SEC. Okay. Now that's what I'm rooting for. And you don't really need much. You just need Auburn to come through at home against Texas A&M, and then Texas A&M to win its home game and Georgia to win its home game, and no other upsets, because there aren't any other games being played between any of the 2 teams who would be involved in that. So we're not far. So I'm rooting for that. If you get that, or if you get one of the 2-loss SEC teams who goes in against Tennessee or Texas A&M, plays a great game, takes a 3rd loss. Right. I mean, now, because you're going to have some of those 2-loss teams in there, what you're in fact doing is penalizing a team for making its conference championship game. Now, if it goes in and they get drilled, that's a different thing. If you go in and you get beat, 35-14 or something like that, then you can make the how did you play argument. But if you go in and you play a competitive game and you come up short by a touchdown, so I would say, I'm going to say more likely than not, but not definitively a 3-loss team.
Yeah, I say absolutely not, because the only way that technically could happen is if Notre Dame happens to lose somewhere in their rest of their schedule, which I don't think can happen. Maybe the Army, maybe, which then would remove Notre Dame more than likely, add another spot to anybody, though. That's the other part, too. Is that a spot for Army? If they beat Notre Dame, is that a spot for another team in the SEC, which will probably be that 3-loss team coming out of the SEC? Because I don't think in the ACC, Big 12, if you're a 2-loss team, you probably don't have a good shot to get in. Let's be real. If it's SMU and Miami that play an ACC championship game, SMU loses that game, Miami obviously gets the automatic qualifier. What happens to SMU? They've had a hell of a year the entire year, and they've only lost then to a Miami and a BYU, who right now is undefeated. But do they get in? Like, why's the question mark around them? And I get it, guys. Look, I played in the ACC. I played against SEC teams when I was a player in college. That league it's different. I understand every week in, week out that the hostile environments, the teams, the coaches, all that kind of stuff is great. But Rece, they signed up for that. Like, I'm not knocking Georgia for having the number 1 strength of schedule, but that's the schedule they drew. I'm also not going to knock Indiana for winning all the games that they had. Again, because if I'm a player on Indiana's team, I'm like, man, how are we getting penalized for only playing the teams that we had in front of us? That's how I see it as a player.
I want to be clear. I don't think you should be penalized for it, but you can't be granted absolution for it. It can't be dismissed. Oh, well, that's the way it goes, because Texas has a ridiculously easy schedule, relatively speaking, to the other contenders in the SEC. That's just the way it fell. Oklahoma, Florida, for instance, who aren't in it, drew just brutal schedules. And Indiana, I mean, Pete said it earlier, they've lost more games than anyone in the history of the sport. You can't sit there and quibble over who Indiana drew in Big Ten play or who they're playing in their non-conference. The one thing I will say about Indiana, they are doing what elite teams do. And I've seen the numbers about how comparable they are to Michigan. They are, with the exception of Michigan, who stood in there and fought, trying to, make a signature win for its season. But everyone else, Indiana did what elite teams do. They take mediocre teams and they beat their eyes shut. And that's what Indiana's done. And I think you deserve credit for that. One other little thing I want to hit on this before we turn our attention to some other things, because all of these rankings are going to change. They're going to be upsets. I think we're going to do a segment on Game Day this weekend called Who's Going to Get Got? Because every week somebody's getting got. Somebody is tripping up. I mean, Kansas has already gotten Iowa State. They've got a chance. Got a chance this weekend against BYU. Got a shot at Colorado later. So somebody is going to get got before this is over. Yeah. But we talked a little bit about this notion of escaping and what's a good loss and what's a bad loss. I think there is a cumulative effect on some of these teams as you watch them play. Miami is a prime example. Miami took a big dip in the rankings after losing to Georgia Tech. We might differ slightly on, what level of loss that is. But I think the reason Miami took the hit was because of the escape against Virginia Tech, the escape against Cal, Louisville. That's just a good team on the road that they played and they won a close game. You don't kill them on that one. The fact that even though Duke has a good record, they go into the game late, they pull away. I think I might be forgetting one more close one, but you get the point. They were very, very fortunate to escape Cal. Very fortunate, even to the point of the replay official not saying he was wrong, but that's what it took for them to get past Virginia Tech. So sometimes you have a bit of a cumulative effect. And, I know I've been getting some online grief from our friends at BYU. I didn't realize I was spending the entire podcast, Pete, talking down about BYU. They deserve a lot of credit, but they've pulled great escapes too. I mean, they escaped Oklahoma State, who is dreadful. And they were very fortunate, right call, as we said the other night, but very fortunate that they got the call and that the timeout was called on the play before, which would have ended the game too, just in the nick of time. But you get credit for that until you get got. And once you get got, sometimes the committee goes, okay, all right. They escaped a few, but it catches up with them and there's a bit of a cumulative effect.
Rece, you've always said if you're not good enough, a loss will find you. And Miami was like begging to be the team that epitomized that this season, right? Because they flirted and danced and needed 2 calls to go their way. Whether you agree with them or not, they needed 2 calls to go their way. So they were an interesting team that obviously had some defensive deficiencies. They gave up yards in bunches, and in some ways that accentuated the wonder of Cam Ward, right? Because it was like, okay, how can he bail them out again? How can he go hang 56 on somebody in order to let them survive? So I do think it's worth, and the committee always says Ward says it all the time, we start with a fresh piece of paper and a blank slate, and a loss for Miami. And really, they look pretty bad in that game. The whole game. A loss for Miami makes you reframe how the rest of the schedule looked. You're like, okay, this is a team that's susceptible. I think EJ brought up a good point earlier. Like, you have to envision, how is this Miami team going to hold up against an SEC team, right? Like, how are they going to look when you talk about the eye test? How is this transferable? Well, they went to the Swamp and they kicked Florida's tail. So I'm going to give them a lot of credit for that. That is a middle of the road SEC team and they pounded them. But I do think as the season has gone on, they've garnered and earned skepticism for their ability to hang in the heaviest weight of fights, right? In that top class. Are they really in that top tier? So I feel pretty good about where the committee has them. I don't have a huge quibble. They have left breadcrumbs of questions throughout the season. If you look at their performance week in and week out.
Yeah, I'm not mad at where they are at 9, but I will say Georgia Tech more or less gave a blueprint for what maybe these last 2 teams in the ACC could do, and it's keep away. If you look at the time of possession in that game, it was 34 minutes, 49 seconds Georgia Tech, 25 minutes, 11 seconds Miami. And when you have a ultra confident quarterback, a ultra talented quarterback like Cam Ward, take the ball out of his hands and make sure you score, whether it's a touchdown or even a field goal to get 3 points, but also convert on third down. And guys, the defense struggled so bad to where it was a true freshman that was in there making the throws that Haynes King couldn't. And Haynes King, I think, was 6 for 6, but he's injured. Obviously, he was hurt. Mm-hmm. He, gutted out, his time to go out there and play for them. But I am concerned with Miami. And, even that last game against Syracuse on the road, that's not a for sure victory because Syracuse has a comparable quarterback and guys that can make plays as well. But to see them at 9, I actually thought that was a little bit of grace from the committee, truthfully. I thought they might have dropped even further than that.
ACC, okay, I've got to get this in or I'll forget. When they play Syracuse, it's going to be really hard not to root for Syracuse because we all want Fran Brown to shower.
Yes.
I mean,
honestly, I got like a ritual. Like when we lose, I ain't even getting a shower till early this morning. I just be mad. I just brush my teeth. But it's like I don't deserve soap. I don't deserve to do all that. I'm just focused on like trying to get back and trying to make sure that our players mentally understand and know that I let them down. There's a process that I follow every week. Win, lose, or draw. Only thing is like my wife, I can't sleep in the bed if we lose because I ain't gonna get in the shower for that day. I'm just mad and I just sit there. I just brush my teeth. That's what I have to do so y'all won't say my breath stink. But I'm just kind of locked in at certain things, certain ways. I think you gotta earn the right to do certain things. So, winners get washed. You know what I'm saying? I'm a loser. I just kind of waited a little bit.
We can root for hygiene.
At the very least, Rece, he's been brushing his teeth. He's been brushing his teeth at the very least. But yeah, we can't have him musty and God.
He didn't get that. At what point have you served your penance after a loss as a coach, and you feel free to go in and use. I don't know, I don't have a soap sponsorship, so I'm not going to call a brand, but you use the soap to freshen up or the body wash or whatever it is you use. You guys like the body wash or do you go with a bar of soap?
I'm body wash. That's because of my wife though. So I use what she has. Yeah, I'm body wash.
Body wash. Definitely body wash.
How many teams do we get in from the ACC? Is the ACC barring collapse someplace 1-bid league?
It's a 2-bid league.
You think
I
it
think
will
it's
be?
2. I still think it's 2. A lot of what SMU and even Miami, like I said about Louisville, if Louisville continues to win, I think that helps their argument. Ultimately, SMU has to win out, get to the conference championship. It'd be nice if they did win because then you have Miami, who I still think will find a way in, especially after a loss to Georgia Tech. You can tell the committee is not penalizing them too much. But I do think right now it's a 2-big league. And guys, really 2 weeks ago, I thought it was a 3-bid. I thought Clemson might have a shot to get themselves back in contention to find a way in. If Notre Dame lost or, if two of these other SEC teams took some L's, maybe they might have snuck in. But right now, I think it's a 2-bid league.
I'm going 1. You really
need a Notre Dame free fall and some other stuff. I feel like there's 7. Right? Ultimately, the 12 becomes 7
at large.
When you're going at larges, right? Mm-hmm. And if Notre Dame takes the 1, I think it goes pretty simple 3-3 and we go out. I mean, what Big Ten teams can fall out at this point?
I think Indiana could. I know this is going to sound crazy. If they get boat raced, not if they lose. I mean, if they get, they do, and I don't think this will happen, by the way. I think Indiana's going to be fine. But if, let's say, for instance, that Ohio State were to do to Indiana what Indiana did to Nebraska, again, I don't think so. But I think then that would call in the other parts of their resume into question. So that would be the only. I don't see. I mean, Penn State would have to lose again. Ohio State and Oregon are in. I think so. I think we're good.
Reese, quick question though about that, because is this because Indiana is Indiana? You know what I mean, like historically, or is this genuinely because of the team that you see this year?
I know. I think that they look like a playoff team, EJ, and I don't think it's brand bias. I think it's that 100 in the schedule. I think it's the best win is Nebraska.
Strength of schedule.
And it's not just strength of schedule. If they played a couple more teams that you thought, even if they were 6-3 type teams, if they played a couple more and beaten, I mean, there's not anybody in there that you look at and you think they're really good. But again, I want to emphasize, I think Indiana is a playoff caliber team, and I think they've played like one. I want to emphasize that. I'm just saying, in a hypothetical world, because they don't have much on the resume, they have to continue to accentuate what they're winning at. So they have to continue to look good. That doesn't mean they have to win. If they lose, if they lose by 10 in Columbus, they're in. And that will be right, by the way. That will be proper. So in my judgment.
We always try to predict, EJ,
when Rece will get aggregated and misunderstood. So I think the aggregated headline is going to be Rece Davis hates Indiana, they're frauds. I think that's what this will that will end up on the internet at some point this week in our group text. And I'll say, Rece, why do you hate Indiana so much? They were so nice to you in Bloomington. They were great to Coach Corso, and you hate them. You just hate them. Indiana are, by the way, they're execution monsters, execution monsters. I can't see them getting beat by 50 in Columbus. I can't do it. And I think if they lose, and look, they can lose there, right? A lot of good teams have gone to Columbus and lose, and it's an authoritative loss. I think they lose their home playoff fortunes. But if they go there and win, they're in the Big Ten title game, and they can clinch a bye. Right. But if they go there and play well, I think that's an interesting Indiana conversation. So say they lose 31-20, right? Ohio State beats them, sound game, something in that. Yeah, and I think they get a home game.
Maybe so, and that's where they are right now. And by the way, that's precisely what I think is going to happen. I think they're going to go. They're going to play well, and Ohio State's got a few more horses than they do, and they'll win Ohio State, and they're at home, and they'll win the game, and Indiana will go to the playoff. And that will be as it should be, in my judgment. EJ, your alma mater, making some serious moves here, firing coordinators, firing assistant coaches, trying to reboot. What's it going to take to get the Seminoles back on solid footing?
It's going to take $1 million in NIL to get a good quarterback. In all seriousness, I think it starts at the quarterback position. And I'm joking about the money and all that kind of stuff. I don't know that.
Yeah, you're too low.
Exactly right.
You don't have enough money.
That's probably more expensive. But I think it starts there, because if you insert a Cam Ward, if you insert even a Curtis Rourke, you know what I mean? Like who's at Indiana? If you insert Dylan Gabriel, you then have an eraser. And what I mean by an eraser, he can cover up some of the iniquities that your team might have around him. He can cover up a left guard that gives up, an easy sack. He can make a play and then find a guy to get open. You just didn't see that from DJU or even these two other young quarterbacks. And again, the young quarterbacks you get because they're inexperienced. Ultimately, I was a little bit shocked by the firing of the coordinators and Ron Doing is the receivers coach, but maybe that's more of a recruiting thing as well. And also, was that out of Coach Norvell's hands? Did somebody from above say, hey, you need to make a change? What is it? Because you're trying to figure out, well, what's the reason why they're so bad this year? I go back to players, because ultimately coaches guide and all that, but the players are the ones that have to go out there and win you football games, make throws, make stops on defense, and they haven't done that consistently, not nearly consistently enough to this season where they're 1-9, which is it sounds crazy saying that out of my mouth.
So, EJ, here's an interesting question
that you're uniquely positioned to answer as a former Florida State quarterback who has a great relationship with Mike Norvell. You and I have called the Florida State spring game the last 2 years. Do you think Mike Norvell needs to give up play calling? We've seen Eli Drinkwitz do it in past years. We've seen guys do it in past years. Now, I think Mike Norvell is a gifted play caller, right? When I take a 10-year snapshot of his time at Arizona State, his time at Memphis, and obviously his time at Florida State, but the world has changed, and it's changed very fast. I'm curious. I think that's one of the philosophical crossroads that FSU is at right now. What's your opinion on what Mike Norvell should do there?
Pete, I don't think he should give up calling plays, because if you think 2 seasons ago when Florida State got back to winning 10-plus games, I think they won the bowl game over Oklahoma. Coach Norvell was calling plays that year. Before that, it was Kenny Dillingham, who's now the head coach at Arizona State, having a great year as well. They're going to a bowl, and it's awesome. But I felt like Coach Norvell and Jordan Travis, and I mentioned Jordan Travis because he had a dude at quarterback. He had an eraser, a guy that can make those plays. They were on the same page. For whatever reason, it just seemed like there was no telepathy with Coach Norvell and DJU or even these other 2 young quarterbacks. So I would say no. I think that would be an overreaction, in fact. I mean, yeah, you can hire a coordinator, but I still believe in Coach Norvell's abilities to call plays, because he's called good plays. Guys drop balls or guys in the throws. That's ultimately what it's come down to, execution.
Unthinkable season for the Seminoles, but hey, we've seen just how quickly things can turn. We've spent a great deal of this episode talking about Indiana, and they've turned it in a heartbeat, and nobody has worked the portal better than Mike Norvell over the last few years. Didn't work out this year, obviously, but more times than not, he has navigated those waters in an expert fashion. We appreciate you listening and watching the College Game Day Podcast. Urge you to subscribe or download wherever you prefer to get your podcasts.